This is the part where I would normally open the video with some sort of formal intro or a well-written, thought-out joke that you guys will occasionally even find funny, but no thoughts head Melia figure right now. I'll get back to you on that. I know I've said before that I'm not really fond of the way they decided to divide up the story of Xenoblade 1 into chapters, but since those chapters were visibly implemented into the game with Definitive Edition after only being save point prompts in the middle of cutscenes in the original, let's actually talk about them. It is crucial to note that I don't mind the existence of chapters in my Xenoblade games at all, or even one specifically. I just have some issues with where they chose to divide up the story of 1 into the chapters, and even if we were given the exact same amount of chapters the final story has to work with, I would probably shift around a few of the points, but this isn't really a criticism video, this is a creative video. Wow. Both Xenoblade X and 2 have titles for their chapters, but 1 does not, at least in the game itself. The Monado Secret Files, the art book, does have names for each chapter when it lists all of the cutscenes, but these names aren't really titles, they're just quotes that are spoken during the chapter, and I really do have to disagree with some of the choices they made. Like, the chapter, Your Blade, It Did Not Cut Deep Enough is from, has a different line than Your Blade, It Did Not Cut Deep Enough as the headline for the chapter. So, yeah. Chapter names in X and 2 do sometimes reference important things that are said in that chapter, especially Xenoblade 2's Chapter 3, but more often than not, they're an actual originally made title that either just poetically describes what's going to go on in the chapter, or tie into something thematically relevant, or to other events that go on during it. So, with 1 now outright acknowledging its chapters in the game itself, I figured why not come up with proper titles for them that better reflect the naming conventions of the other games, especially 2 since it's the most similar to 1 plot-wise. Now, obviously, I'm going to have to spoil Xenoblade 1 all the way through, but for once, it's only going to be that game. I know a lot of people are probably turned off from my content because so many videos recently are spoilers for the entire Xeno series, and even though I do provide timestamps to skip around certain games now, it still is very intimidating, especially to someone who just got into the series with the 2 Xenoblade games that are on Switch. So if you're feeling intimidated by all that content, please still stick around, subscribe to the channel. I'm going to try to make an effort to make more videos that are just on one game, and not just be pumping out constant Xeno series staples, here's how to tie all the games together. Yes, I know it is weird to hear me asking for people to subscribe outside of a dumb joke, and I'm probably going to put all my asking to subscribe in dumb jokes in the future, but I'm still gonna do it because, man, I've been having some really weird fluctuating viewer numbers recently. I think the algorithm's trying to kill my channel again, and just saying, hey, please subscribe at the beginning of every video really worked for Enel this year, so I'm getting really sidetracked. Let's talk about chapters again. Another thing that does sort of set 1 apart from the other games is that it, in addition to just having more story chapters than the others, counts its prologue and epilogue separately, at least in the art book. In the cutscene viewer, the prologue is part of chapter 1 and the epilogue is part of the final chapter. So that's interesting. There's 2 other separate things, so I am going to be going by art book rules. And while X has a separate prologue and no defined epilogue, 2 just straight up opens, the first cutscene is the beginning of chapter 1, and the end of final chapter screen doesn't pop up until after the post-credit scene, so this is just going to be a bit different in structure from both of the other games. It also means that we're now going to need to find 19 names instead of just 17, because there are a lot of chapters in this game, but that just means more opportunities for me to flex my creative muscles, which I assure you are the only muscles I've been flexing since quarantine started, because insert depressing joke here. With the prologue, we have just the Dunban sequence in the past, and I'm going to call this an Endless Sea. Why am I not calling this something like Hero of the Homs, Monado, or just the Battle of Sword Valley? Well, this one is mostly just to set up a bookend I'm putting in way later on, but it does fit. The first shot of the entire series is just the ocean before even the Titans show up, and it does later zoom out to show just how insignificant even these continental beings are compared to the infinite water. Also, an Endless Sea is like one of the first sets of words spoken in the entire game, so there's that too. And then we have Chapter 1, which starts with the 1-year time skip where we first meet Shulk, and ends with the sight of the Mechon attacking the colony from Tephra Cave. I decided to just call this one Colony 9 for a few reasons. First off, it shouldn't really have a big, in-your-face, grandiose-sounding title, because this is not the first chapter of Xenoblade 2. At the end of the first chapter of Xenoblade 2, the whole big set the plot in motion event, that game's equivalent of Fiora's death has already happened, where Fiora's actual death doesn't happen until the end of Chapter 2 of this game. So to me, it doesn't really feel right to give Chapter 1, which doesn't have a lot of that stuff and is mostly just an introduction to the main characters and world building for Colony 9, some big, grandiose, massive statement type of name like Chapter 1 of Xenoblade 2 just being called Encounters, or even X's prologue being Awakening. So I think a much more down-to-earth title does fit. Also, X's first proper chapter is also largely just world-building New Los Angeles, and an introduction to a bunch of important characters, and that chapter is just called New Los Angeles, so there is a precedent. Chapter 2 goes from where Chapter 1 left off, obviously, to when Ryan and Shulk are leaving the colony. For this, I could just go with Loss, but that's already the name of the scene where Fiora dies in the event theater, so that seems a little cheap. Also, memes. I decided to go with Face for this. Yeah, you're going to be seeing a few one-word titles throughout this, but half of 2's chapters have one-word titles, and this does fit the build-up of Metal Face as what a lot of people playing the game for the first time are probably going to think is the main villain, and not, like, the main villain for maybe a third of the story, you know? Monado would also make a lot of sense as a chapter title, and I am saving Monado for a bit later. I'm only going to use Monado once in any of these chapter titles, so yeah, blowing my load here might not be the best idea. Chapter 3 is fairly interesting because it's just Tephra Cave 2 through the Kneecap Hill scene. It's not a very big chapter, but some important stuff does happen, and it ends with the extremely powerful Our Enemy scene where they look out at Makanis. And then it also does sort of introduce some new foes in the Arachnos, and Shulk has some visions and stuff, so I think Enmity as the name for this chapter fits well. I know this is a bit more of a breather chapter after the whole Attack on Colony 9 thing, and I still gave it a kind of pretentious, one-word, very impactful sounding title, but I think it works, so I'm doing it. Chapter 4 then goes up until Zord flies off with Juju. It would kind of make sense to call the next chapter Colony 6 because, well, you actually visit it there, but I'm instead calling this chapter that because this is where you find out about its fate, and you meet your only party member that comes from there. Plus, it is the party's goal to get to Colony 6 at both the beginning and end of the chapter, so they still have the place on their mind and all. This is also a setup for the fact that Chapter 5 is called This Is For You. This is obviously part of a very important line spoken by Atharon, but it's also super vital to Shulk's growth. The first big we can change the future together moment is when the actions of the party cause Atharon to say something different than he did in the vision. Although, ironically, the This Is For You part remains the same. Also, there's just the fact that Colony 6, This Is For You, is straight up a paraphrasing of Atharon's line. I had more chapters to work with than the other games would have given me, so I decided to throw in a few instances of 2 chapter titles connecting to each other. So there's going to be a few more of these. Chapter 6 is a very short chapter and only covers Satoru Marsh, which has a few less cutscenes than most areas have, but the Definitive Edition Theater does list Dixon's explanation of Prison Island as part of this chapter and not 5. I first considered calling the chapter Bionis, because there is going to be a later chapter I call Mechonis, and this is the start of the arc where the goal is to just climb the Titan, but the beginning and end of the chapter focus on new goals, while Shulk's big dream sequence and his conversation with Dixon in the middle is mostly memories and visions, so I think Past and Future is a title that works well for what little story the chapter does have. Then we have Chapter 7, which follows up one of the shortest and least dense chapters in the game with a relatively long, relatively dense one. There's a lot that can be mentioned here, and I'm gonna have to cut Alvis out of the title entirely, focusing on 2 of the other big important aspects of the chapter, Melia's introduction and the setting of Machna. I decided to go with The Lady in the Woods as the title for this chapter. You could obviously tell what I'm referring to there, but this is also a reference to the fact that Melia's guards refer to her as Lady in the intro cutscene of the chapter, and the Japanese name of Machna Forest's soundtrack is Machna Woods, not Machna Forest, so there's where the woods come from. This title is kind of out of keeping with the rest of them, and it's even a bit whimsical and fairy tale-esque, but this is Napon Land. This is the most magical fairy tale-esque part of the game, so I do still think it kind of fits. I also kind of waffled a bit on whether to be the Lady and the Woods, Lady and the Woods, or Lady of the Woods. So, yeah. Lady of the Woods is simultaneously a reference to Tolkien, Catholicism, and a neat rock formation in a US national park, so all things considered, that might be the more Xeno choice to go with, but I felt that Lady and the Woods, or the Lady and the Woods, put a more equal emphasis on Macna and Melia, and the Nopon can take all of the attention they can get because this is the only real mention they're going to have. Ricky even isn't going to be directly alluded to in any of the rest of the titles, so I felt like it was kind of important to at least say, hey, fluffy guys have forest, this here, play game. For Chapter 8, I might be letting my bias show slightly because we are giving Melia 2, or more technically 1.5 chapter titles in a row, because I'm calling Chapter 8 Heir of the High Entia. Would this chapter name kind of be spoiling Melia's whole deal, since it starts at just the beginning of Aerith C, and if we're going by both X and 2 logic, the title of the chapter does show up around the first cutscene of that chapter? Yes, but I do still think it works. This entire chapter is about internal High Entia issues, and explores what the remnants of their old empire's like, and what exactly it means for Melia to be the successor of the line of Antiqua. It also segues very nicely into Chapter 9, Heir to the Monado. This is why I've avoided using the name Monado for any previous chapter. If it's going to be used for any chapter before the last one, which, spoilers, I'm not calling the true Monado, it should be here on the chapter that's almost 100% Prison Island, Wham episode, and also the Monado 2 happens. While Heir of the High Entia isn't said at all, and Melia's actual title is Hope of the High Entia, that title isn't really applied to her until much later in the story, and Zanza does directly refer to Shulk as the chapter title within the chapter, so I do think it works rather nicely, and there's also a little bit of Shulk-Melia dichotomy going on. Shulk does see some of himself in her struggles, so I do think it makes sense for their chapter titles to be kind of references to each other. Chapter 10 puts us in a bit of a weird situation because it's just kind of Valak Mountain.
That's the puerile reason you killed all those innocent people! Ravaged our home! I love this body! The power! Demands you'll never win! Get on your knees and worship me! Never.
There's not enough revenge stuff from Shulk, Dunban, or Egil yet to be able to call it Vengeance. I did also consider the name Traitors and Tyrants, because this is where Mumkar reveals himself and when Egil shows up, but first off, there's only one of each, and not pluralizing the title doesn't roll off the tongue as well, and second off, it kind of spoils the only two big things that happen in this chapter. Like, yeah, I know, I just said we're gonna call the chapter where it'll give you the chapter title before Melia is revealed to be the princess as Heir of the High Entia, but Melia being revealed isn't the only important plot thing that happens in this chapter. Chapter 10, on the other hand, it's mostly just character interaction, and it's not bad character interaction, but plot-wise, the biggest things that happen are Mumkar reveal and Egil reveal, so I didn't want to just kind of reveal the entire thing in the chapter title. Long before I decided this title, I decided to make a later title a reference to an X chapter, so we're going to make this chapter's title a reference to 2. 2's opening theme is called Xenoblade 2 Where It All Began, and a kind of random fact about it is, this is the only time in official material where Xenoblade 2 is written in Roman numerals. It's Xenoblade II Where It All Began, like in the official soundtrack, whereas physically in the game's logo and everywhere else, it's the Arabic numeral 2, so I don't really know where that came from, but it sure is interesting. Maybe Xenoblade X really is Xenoblade 10, and they decided to make the 2 a normal 2 and not a Roman numeral 2, because that would be, like, way too obvious if we were to see that it was just Roman numerals on the actual game. I don't know. I thought I wasn't going to be talking about other games in this video. This chapter has scenes in Ase Tower, which is where Shulk first came into contact with the Monado, and it's sort of the origin point for a lot of things that happened in the story, because it's where Zanza possessed Shulk, it's where the Monado came into possession of the Homs, it's where Dixon and Shulk's relationship started. Obviously, the whole space station at the end of the game thing is where it really all began because of Klaus and the experiment and whatnot, but at least in terms of Shulk's story, this is where it all began, so I think it is a pretty decent title for the chapter. Chapter 11, in contrast to the last chapter, is something I can very easily mine for double meanings and kind of stupid puns. This chapter is the walk across Sword Valley through the infiltration and ultimate fall of Galahad Fortress. In it, you traverse the Sword of the Mechonis, have that small Shulk vs. Dunban moment during the final Mumkar fight, and then you have to fight against Fiora. You might be able to see where this is going. You go through Sword Valley. Shulk's sword and Dunban's sword make contact with each other. Then the party has to fight Fiora, who uses two swords. Yeah, I'm gonna call this one Crossing Swords. Is kind of lame pun appropriate for this? Not really, but it still works, and you can choose to interpret it a lot more seriously than I am probably doing so I do think it still works. Like, this just kind of jumped out of my mind and slapped me on the face when I thought of it, so I can't not put it in. Chapter 12 I'm just going to call Reunions. This is a pretty straightforward one. It's mostly a breather chapter after the insanity of Galahad, and serves to reintroduce Fiora and hint at her character dynamics with people she hasn't met yet. It's also a fairly smooth transition into Chapter 13, Mechonis. This as a title works on many levels. You're meeting the people of Mechonis, getting a new goal to travel through the Titan in search of Egil, and then this is also the chapter where you actually enter Mechonis proper for the first time, and the beginning of it is set up for the entire Mechonis arc, which goes through Chapter 15, but in between that and the 13 we're talking about is Chapter 14. This one goes through the Agnirtha Egil fight and then lasts for a couple scenes after, ending around Gado's sacrifice. The first scene of the chapter is Alvis asking Shulk why he wants to change the future, and then talking about the true Monado. It also has the party going through a lot to stop Egil, only to ultimately fail in the end, and he awakens Mechonis anyway despite their best efforts. They thought they could change the future of Mechonis moving, and they failed. Since I haven't used a kind of obvious title yet, and this is an important instance of it occurring, or rather not occurring, I do think it's okay to call this chapter Change the Future. It also has some nice red herring stuff of, oh, you're going to confront Egil, the mastermind behind Mechonis, leader of the evil Titan, this might be the end game. So, it's nice there, it kind of masks some of the spoilers and stuff. You might want to go super meta and even just say, final chapter, change the future, and then at the end of the chapter instead say, chapter 14, change the future, or something really stupid. Despite all this, it doesn't fit super well, but I think it is a title that needs to be used at some point, and this is also near the point in the game where talking about changing the future is kind of phased out for more talking about seizing our destiny. As for Chapter 15, I initially wanted to make this something referencing the fact that Shulk and Egil are two sides of the same coin, and the important philosophical and thematic implications of stuff like that, but then they just had to make this chapter consist of only Mechonis core. Once they did that, I was locked in my stupid Xeno has to reference other Xeno at all times brain, so we're going to call this one Into the Core as a reference to a certain big story moment in X, which is titled that same thing. Now, of course, if one plays this modified chapter title version of Definitive Edition and then X, like I would actually recommend for someone getting into the series, it would look like X chose to reference a 1 here instead of the other way around, but let's not get hung up on hypotheticals when all we're really doing in this video is coming up with 19 cool words or phrases that sound like they sort of fit with the story. Speaking of that, Chapter 16, The Curse of Zanza. This is the chapter I have the most issues with the length of because I think it was made too short. It goes to the Telethia transformation sequence with Callian. Only that, when I really wish it ended after Shulk came back, but that's not really relevant here. The bulk of the chapter is the Zanza reveal, and a curse of Zanza was brought up before by Egil right in the lead up to this moment happening. If such a curse actually exists, it's certainly on full effect here. This is the Zanza chapter where he shows up, hijacks the plot, and makes everything go his way and not the way of the party, so I feel like him not being at least alluded to in the title of the chapter would be wrong. Chapter 17 is the one I knew the title of before I even started scripting this video. It's the most obvious. It was the scrapped subtitle for the game, still used as the subtitle on the Wii save data menu, and the world is brought to a new beginning at the end of the chapter, so we have to call this one Beginning of the World. Just imagine. Xenoblade 2, when it introduces the title to its final chapter, is an incredible drop just because of the cutscene where it occurs, and just because of the text, final chapter, title of chapter, which you can tell is going to be impactful just by looking at the title, even if you don't know exactly what's going to happen. So, just imagine. According to the event theater, the first cutscene of Chapter 17 is Shulk and Alvis's conversation there. So, that's right after the whole Telethia thing. It's right after the big Callian moment. Then, fade into space, Shulk and Alvis talking, floating, nothing makes sense, and you just see, in one corner of the screen, final chapter, Beginning of the World. Chills. I'm the one who thought of it, and I got chills. Don't know if that happened to you guys, but man, this entire video is worth it just for thinking of that. Like, thinking of that is what made me do this entire video. Is good. It's pretty obvious, and I don't think I was particularly creative in thinking of it, but is good. While the events theater considers the final cutscene to be part of Chapter 17, in the art book it is referred to as the epilogue, and this is where I bring everything full circle, because I'm calling the epilogue A Boundless Sky. This is the reason why the prologue title was a little clunky. I'm bookending the chapter names with the first quote from the beginning of the game. It's also a super thematically relevant title. The old world consisted of the endless sea with nothing but titans, while the new one is infinite in its life, and there's nothing but new friends that await beyond this boundless sky. This would be a great place to end the video, but we do still sort of have to talk about the Melia story, because Future Connected is supposed to be an epilogue. That is the name given to it by the developers and by Nintendo, but the art book already calls the final scene of the main game the epilogue, so if you want to add part 20 to this, you're gonna have to kind of be a little creative, either rename the epilogue, or do what I'm doing and just call it After Story Future Connected and put that on the end of the list. You could probably split FC into at least 2 chapters, since as is, it is longer than most individual story chapters of the main game, but the game itself doesn't have any actual divisions, and I'm not sure where I personally would split it. I wouldn't split it more than once, so we're just going to leave it as one thing. So to wrap things up, in all we have Prologue, An Endless Sea, Chapter 1, Colony 9, Chapter 2, Face, Chapter 3, Enmity, Chapter 4, Colony 6, Chapter 5, This Is For You, Chapter 6, Past and Future, Chapter 7, The Lady in the Woods, Chapter 8, Heir of the High Entia, Chapter 9, Heir to the Monado, Chapter 10, Where It All Began, Chapter 11, Crossing Swords, Chapter 12, Reunions, Chapter 13, Mechanis, Chapter 14, Change the Future, Chapter 15, Into the Core, Chapter 16, The Curse of Zanza, Final Chapter, Beginning of the World, Epilogue, A Boundless Sky, After Story, Future Connected. I don't know, what do you think about this? It's probably neither what you had in mind for chapter titles or good, but it's what I could come up with. Of course, feel free to leave your own ideas in the comments and subscribe to stick around for more Xeno goodness, because we're doing the YouTuber thing now. I'm telling you to subscribe twice in one video. But this video, that video where I told you to subscribe twice, is now over. So, as always, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I already told you to subscribe, so I won't do that again. But I'm just gonna be like, hey, how's your day going? I have to do the thing where I extend the end slate long enough to show my patrons on screen, because I'm very grateful for all of their support, especially when we had a bit of a scare where I thought someone had leaked my Cosmos Smash video a couple days early, when in reality I just made the mistake of putting it in a playlist early, like while it was still unlisted. I only sent the link to patrons. Turns out if you look at the playlist, you could still see unlisted videos in it, so someone found that while browsing the Xenosaga or the Smash playlist, and just linked that elsewhere. So thanks for putting up with me, patrons. I make mistakes sometimes, but I think you already knew that just based on this channel. But yeah, that's enough for me. Until next time, this is Luxin, signing off.